Hello, everybody, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 12 of A Conversation with Cometan. Today, I'm going to be providing you with a lecture on my ancestry. And I'm really excited to give this one because I've been studying my ancestry for the last 3 years nearly now, and I've uncovered so much interesting information about a huge group of people really who if it weren't for them I wouldn't be here today, of course. So I'm here. I am in a more casual outfit. I've got my vest on today, and I've got a nice Calvin Klein shirt over the top, and I'm here and ready for this lecture to start. So let's begin. So this lecture is titled The Curious History of the Ancestors of Cometan, because it is exactly that. It is a curious history. It is a history that is constantly evolving. There's information flying all over the place. That's one of the hardest parts about doing ancestry research, and anyone who's involved in sort of genealogical or ancestry research will understand that there is so much information, there is so many rabbit holes that you go down. And I experienced that recently, where I thought for a while that this certain person was one of my great-great-grandparents, and they weren't. And so this this kind of changed the whole trajectory of part of my ancestry. So it just opened up a whole other world. So it's a great hobby. It's something that I hope to continue to do for the rest of my life, and hopefully my children will continue this tradition of ancestry. So let's start. I suppose just the purpose of this lecture is just to give a brief overview of some of the most interesting life stories that I've been able to compile from my ancestry, to provide a sort of brief history of Lancashire integrated to my ancestors, because that's where we're from, and also just to explore just some of the legacies of some of these great people who if they did not exist, neither would I. So let's begin. I think, so whenever I study something, it has to be done systematically. I am a typical man, I study things in a way that has to be systematized. I have to organize everything. Everything has to be, put in its place. And that's generally, I think, there's still the consensus as to how men's brains work. They work best in the systematic area, and so I'm definitely that. And so I apply this to astronism, of course, to my PhD work, but I also apply this to ancestry. And so what I started to do was to divide my time, my sort of phases of ancestry into different periods. And so the first one was from March 2019 to July 2020, as you can see there. And this is called an ancestral investigation phase. So this is a period of time where I know a certain amount of information, and then usually the phase ends when a whole revelation takes place. I get a group of pictures that I've never seen before, and then new ancestors come in because of that, or a document emerges, and I get a brand new understanding of my ancestry because of that. So each time these phases starts is when I have come across a new discovery, a new major discovery of major new information. And so this is how I structure my time, but also how I sort of systematize the history of my of my investigation of my ancestry. So it's all systems upon systems, but I think that's a good way to do it, because it shows how I've progressed over the last 3 years of doing my ancestry. So Most of the people, actually, probably all of the people that you'll see listed in this video or spoken about in this video are Lancashire born and bred. So I am from Lancashire, and so are my ancestors, really going back to the 1500s. Most of them are from Lancashire, except for a few branches, which we will speak about. And of course, Lancashire is, for anyone who doesn't know, is in northwest England, in the United Kingdom. And Lancashire it's a very interesting place, of course, because for a very long time, it was seen as a very wild place, especially sort of around the 1600s time, maybe even going into the 1700s as well. It was seen as a very sort of wild place, a place that wasn't so far away from London, you know, so far away from the monarch's sort of gaze, if you know what I mean, and the monarchy's sort of power structure in a way. And so it was this place where also a lot of Catholics lived. So obviously after the Reformation, they were not best treated, of course. And so it was just seen as this kind of this backwater of England, really, that really, I don't know, that was kind of a bit of a wild, scary place, I suppose, because you also had the Pendle witches that we were well known for up in Pendle, and also Catholics, ooh, scary Catholics, as they were back then. I think a lot of people were, you know, kind of suspicious of them as well. So it's an interesting place. It continues to be. Lancashire's history is always evolving, but there is so much that is part of Lancashire. And on the map on the right hand side there, you can see some of our most famous landmarks. And so one thing I just wanted to mention was that in doing my ancestry, one thing that I didn't realize was that I would learn so much more about Lancashire itself. And I would visit so many churches and places in Lancashire that I'd never visited before, because I'd never had a reason to go there. So my ancestry and the study of my ancestry in particular has allowed me to visit my county, visit my home county, visit my home land, if you will. So it's been great in all those respects. So I would suggest, if you really want to know where you're from and really understand, get a really good idea of where you're from, do ancestry, study ancestry, because it will just take you places that you've never been to before. Some of these little villages, you know, in Lancashire that I've visited, I never would have visited them before. So it is a great hobby all round, because you don't just learn about people, you learn about the places as well. So just some stats here for, you know, just to kind of like a timestamp, really. So as of February 2022 of the filming of this video, there's over 14,000 people in my tree. There's over 9,000 photos that we've collected together. There's over 1,000 articles, and there's over 11,000 individual records. So that might be things like baptism records, birth records, marriage, death records, things like this, burial records, all things like that. So hopefully, as time goes on, these numbers will continue to increase, and we will get a bigger and bigger tree. And I don't know, maybe create like a world tree, I don't know, something like that, or a Cometan world tree, I don't know, something along those lines. So generally, as a general kind of marker in the sand, my ancestry, in a way, you could say reliably goes back to 1500. 1500 is the kind of cut-off point. Anything in 1400s, you're really going back into the Middle Ages there, the Dark Ages, and I definitely use that term in regards to ancestry, in regards to England in specifically, because it really is the Dark Ages. The Church of England only began to keep records of people's births, deaths, marriages in the early 1500s onwards, I mean, obviously, of course, we know information about prominent families and the nobility back then. Of course, we know about that. But any commoner really was kind of an unknown before 1500, unless they did something remarkable, unless they were included in a book or something like that, written down, or it's sometimes spoken about or something. But yeah, everyday ordinary people who are just living their lives were not recorded before that. So it was the Dark Ages. It really, really was. We'd known nothing before then. And so that's really sad, I think, because, you know, I mean, but also at the same time, you know, we're very lucky in England to be able to have our history. And a lot of other countries don't have this type of history, this, you know, that goes back to the 1500s. So we are very lucky to have that. But you always want more in Ancestry. You know, you always want to know more and more and more and more, because it's kind of one of those things you can get kind of obsessed with. You want to know more about those people, and you want to go back as far as you can. But yeah, reliably, the furthest back you could go in England is to the early 1500s, which is still remarkable. I mean, that's 500 years, isn't it? So, you know, it is a great resource, and we're very, very lucky to have those documents. Just going back a little bit about that systematic approach again, I've structured my ancestry in what we call lines. So these are the families, the 8 families that are derived from my great-grandparents. And so these are called lines, and we go along the different maternal and paternal lines, and it's just a structure just to narrow down, because there's so many other what would you say, there's so many other surnames that are used beyond these, but these, reducing it down to these 8 surnames, we can then, I don't know, refer to things more easily and understand which surnames are part of which line. It's just an easier way for us to structure the ancestry tree, and to structure how we speak about the different branches of the families. So just to give you an overview now, there's a few slides ahead that continue to provide this overview, really. My ancestry centres around the city of Preston, both north and south of Preston, and of course in Lancashire still. And for the most part, we can go back to the 1500s, but they usually around Preston, around the city of Preston. So my family are situated in the same place that I was born in, basically. Going back farther enough, some of my ancestry can be traced back to Blackpool, which is a town on the it's kind of like a seaside resort, you could say, on the Fylde coast. So not too far from Preston, really, still in Lancashire. And then also, you know, hamlets and things, little tiny towns and villages in Lancashire, North Lancashire, and Cumbria as well. But some of the main towns and villages that I can think of off the top of my head are Eccleston, Maudsley, Standish as well. Those are all south of Preston. Horton as well, Whitley Woods, places like that. People who are familiar with Lancashire will know where I'm talking about here, these little villages and things. And they're lovely villages. If anyone gets the chance to visit Lancashire, please do, because they are great little villages. They've still got the English character to them, so please come and visit. And then in sort of North Preston, again, Blackpool, Kirkham is another place that they're from, Lancaster as well, and many other smaller towns like Garstang as well. So quite spread out throughout Lancashire, really, my ancestry, but mainly keeping within Lancashire, mainly. And then, of course, we come to the occupations, which is another major part of ancestry, is trying to figure out, you know, what people did as their occupations, but also the fact that in many instances that your ancestors' occupations can obviously lead them into different moving houses and things, and lead them to different towns and villages, depending on, you know, where their business or where their trade is most sought after. So you found builders and colliers, especially colliers and miners in places like Coppell, which is where my granddad was from, because that's where Coppell was well known for coal mining. And then you found weavers, you know, in Preston, but also in the South Preston towns, like Higher Walton, Bamber Bridge, Penwitham maybe as well. So there's all these type of areas. And then you've got mill workers, wheelwrights, farmers, husbandmen, yeomen, and kind of like landowners and farmers. They're a little bit earlier. There were a few farmers that lasted until the early 1900s, but by then most of our family had gone into other trades, really. Quite a few landlords in my ancestry, or licensed victuallers, sometimes they were called. And then also you've got day labourers, quite a few of those people who kind of like a general labourer, kind of like a jack of all trades type of person. So a huge amount of different trades, really, all of them practical. Notice that all of them, you know, none of them kind of learned trades. Do you know what I mean? That there's no kind of, not like what you could say I am today, you know, like a lecturer or like a university lecturer, or I mean, there was a teacher or two, a few teachers, but nothing like that, which is interesting for me because that's what I am today. So it's kind of, I don't know, it makes me think, well, could some of my ancestors have been that if they'd had the opportunity? I don't know, but a lot of them were practical individuals who had tough lives, really, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But most of the families had a lot of children, so that again makes your tree massive, you know, by the time that you've counted them all. And even the ones that didn't survive, you know, there was a lot a lot of babies that didn't survive due to various illnesses, and also many accidents happened as well. If you go back into my ancestry, there's so many horrible accidents that happened to children and adults as well. So it's quite interesting to read about those, but also kind of sad at the same time that these horrible things happen to them, partly because they didn't know about certain things, you know, but also at the same time, you know, they were more dangerous times in a sense, you know, the way that they used to cook and the way that they used to you know, travel as well, and they were just more dangerous times in that sense. And so another thing, of course, a huge part of so I should probably explain a lot of the work that we do. So a lot of the work is online, using different ancestry websites, usually ancestry.co.uk or ancestry.com for those in the US. And of course it's compiling information, getting baptism records and birth records and things like this, death records, but also a major part of it is trying to find headstones, going to graveyards, finding headstones, trying to decipher, does that headstone match the information I've already got? Is this the right person? It's a huge task. It's a huge task. Specifically the surviving headstones, you would struggle to find anything before 1800. I mean, I have seen quite a few. I have seen quite a few before 1800. So you know, the 1700s, there are surviving headstones and graves for them, just not from my direct ancestry. I think the earliest grave that I saw, and you see a lot of interesting graves, trust me, because some of them, there was one with like a pirate symbol on it. It was really, really cool. That was at Kirkham Church. So if anyone's near Kirkham Church, go and take a look at that. It's some interesting graves, really, really. And you think, gosh, who are these people, you know? But yeah, I think one of the earliest graves that I came across that was still legible, because a lot of them aren't legible, you know, but was probably about 1680, I think it might have been, something like that. And that was at St. Michael on the Wear, or Wire, depending on how you pronounce that. That was at that church there, and it's a beautiful church, really, really old church. And you've got this grave from nearly like 350 years old, probably nearly. So, you know, I think that was one of the earliest. But for us, for my specific ancestry, we're going to look in a second at the oldest grave that I've been able to find that is of my direct ancestor, so one of my great grandparents. Another theme as part of the ancestry of mine is the religiosity, the religious fervor. Huge variety here, huge variety. I mean, I come from a Catholic family on both sides, so in that sense, we are a minority already. Because obviously we live in England, which is predominantly Protestant, specifically Anglican. So we're already a minority, and that causes trouble as well, because the Catholic churches had to stay very much underground before kind of 1520, really. There's very few records that are official records for Catholics before then, because they weren't allowed to say that they were Catholic. So that causes trouble. So that's been another obstacle to have to overcome. But also as well, beyond that, I figured out that there's a huge amount of Mormons in my ancestry who specifically traveled across to the United States and were one of the first English Mormons to do so. And so we'll get into that a little bit later on. But also going further back in time, some of the first Quakers were part of my ancestry in the Moon family, who I'm going to introduce you guys to. And then also some of them were Anglican church wardens. Some of them were Catholic priests that we have. There was a few Catholic priests that we have in our family. So a huge variety of religious affiliations in my ancestry, and which I'm very proud of that. You know, I'm very proud that we have that sort of diversity of religious belief. And I find that very, very interesting for someone who studies religion and philosophy. So many of my ancestors would say the vast majority, because the Reformation happened in the 1500s, and that's when the records began of commoners. The majority of my ancestors from that time onwards were Anglican, probably coming up into maybe the 1800s. Majority of them were Anglican, or professed to be Anglican. Maybe they were Catholic in secret, maybe. I think that did go on a lot. But a lot of them actually converted back to Catholicism following the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. And so again, when they started to convert back, that then triggered other branches to convert back. And then that's why, you know, for the last kind of 200 years, really, most of my ancestors were Catholic. And then on the other hand, so you've got this variety of religious life, you know, different religions, different religious affiliations, very religious people, very pious people, a variety of trades, professions that they did, you know, innkeepers, landlords, colliers, farmers, and all these amazing things. But then you also have this other side where majority of their lives were very, very simple, very, very simplistic, very basic. Many of them probably didn't ever travel beyond Lancashire, I would suggest. Some of them probably did, you know, coming into kind of the 1800s maybe, and especially in the 1900s, I would think, but not anything before then. They wouldn't have travelled outside of their own village, let alone their own county. That would have been a huge, huge undertaking to do that. So I think what we can take from that is that they had very simple lives. You know, a lot of them were born in the same village and died in the same village, you know, so it was a very simple life. And they had to really just use all of their energy just to survive. And I think that was kind of I suppose, a general consensus at the time was that, you know, you had children, and the children were to be brought up to, you know, get into a trade and then to look after the parents and things. And it's not too much different from today, but I think that they just didn't have that kind of broader, sort of more global worldview that maybe more of us have today, where we know we get to travel more, we have more opportunities, can go to university, get higher education. So I think in that sense, they had to put a lot of effort just to survive. And I think that's what kind of, in a way, staggered them from being able to branch out in other ways. Some of them did move around the county, but very, very few, bar some immigrants that I'm going to be speaking about from Ireland. Very few travelled outside of the county of Lancashire for the majority of their lives. I would say that the main events that we know about in these people's lives, in my ancestors' lives, were the date of birth. This is after 1800. Before 1800, they didn't used to record the birth date. They only recorded the baptism date. So in my ancestry tree, you'll see kind of the month and the year. And sometimes the baptism date was the same day as the birth date. If they had gave birth to them, took them straight to the church and had them baptized. So sometimes you do get that, but actually majority of the time, the baptism date is the closest thing that we have to the birth date. But then we also have the wedding, marriage, you know, and then also the death. And it's the same with death, actually. Anything before 1800, we generally don't know the birth date. I think actually it's 1837, because that's when the General Registry Office began to have their to record people's dates of birth and death. So if you died before 1837, your date of death might not have been recorded. Sometimes they are. It's not a universal thing. Sometimes they are, but a lot of the times only the burial date was recorded, because it was recorded at the church who made the recordings. But the death date oftentimes wasn't recorded. So again, you just have to work with that and just kind of have a more general date, or maybe a few days before, maybe guess it. But I don't like to kind of guess. I like to just leave it as it happened this month. You know, we know that they died this month, and then they were buried on this particular date, for example. So those are the kind of the main events that we know about their lives for the majority of the history. It's only, you could say, after 1800 really where we get to know a little bit more information about them. We may know their occupation, of course, but anything else is kind of difficult. Again, the census is only starting, I think, about 1841, something like that. So before then, it's very difficult to know where exactly they lived. We know the towns in which they lived, but we don't often know exactly where they lived. So again, that's difficult, and it is difficult for ancestry researchers. It's just another obstacle that we have to try and deal with. And of course, as you go further back, the information gets less specific and less detailed. But I suppose you know, most of the male families members, you know, worked in practical jobs, laboring jobs, and then most of the women were married off young. They were married off young, most of them. I think the youngest one that I saw wasn't anything crazy. I think it was only 16, but it was, which is legal, obviously. But you know, they were generally married off pretty young, and the women. I would say any time before 1850, really, the women didn't really, and even maybe after that, you know, the women didn't have certainly not full-time jobs. Their full-time job was housemaking and child rearing. So that was their main, in a way, that was their main purpose in life. And so it's kind of interesting. It would be kind of interesting to have an interview with one of these people to say, you know, did you have any ambitions beyond that? Did you actually think, you know, could you do another type of job, or would you have liked to done such and such a job, you know? So, but we'll never get that opportunity. Here are just some of the oldest items that I've managed to accumulate so far from my ancestry. We'll start with the depiction of Ellen Moon. So Ellen Moon, who is on the right-hand corner there, I might be blocking her face, so I apologize for that. She was born in 1792 and she died in 1851. This portrait, I'm guessing, was when she was around 18, something like that. But maybe a bit later on, maybe 1820. But I've put around 1810. Between 1810 and 1820, I would guess that when this illustration was done. And this is the oldest illustration that we have of someone as part of my ancestry. And then we move on to the grave there that you can see. That is the oldest grave that I've managed to take a picture of, and it's the oldest surviving headstone that I've managed to take a picture of, and it's of William Barrow, and he died in 1832. So that's when this headstone was erected. So, and he was born in 1749. So he lived for quite a long time, and people were buried in the grave after him. But that was when he died, and he was the first one in the grave in 1832. So, of course, there are other older graves, but this is the oldest grave that I have of a direct ancestor of mine, someone who is a grandparent of mine. That's what I mean by that. I don't mean cousins or uncles or aunties or anything like that. I mean someone who is a direct ancestor of mine. So 1832, which I think is pretty good. Pretty good. I think we could do better maybe in the future. I think as time goes on, might find maybe something else older, but for now, that's the oldest one that we've got. And then this picture, and this has become, or is becoming, quite a famous picture actually. This is one of Ralph and Agnes Moon. This is our most loved picture in all of my ancestry. This was taken in 1858. We presume in the house in which I think then was Woodcock House on Parr Lane in Eccleston, Lancashire. And it was taken in 1858. And Ralph was a farmer. And by this time, I think he died, yes, the year after this was taken. So they're pretty old by this point, as you can see. And he died a year afterwards, a year after this was taken. So it's kind of amazing. It's very unique. Not many other people have this kind of picture at all. It took a while for us to figure out who this was. You know, there was like scribbles on the back of the picture that we had to decipher, but we got there in the end. And yeah, this is a very unique picture. There's not many other people who've got a direct picture from 1858 of a direct ancestor. So I'm very, very lucky to have this picture, and it has definitely inspired me to want to continue with my ancestry. And yeah, so that's some of the most oldest things that we've been able to recover, which is great. And then another sort of aspect of my ancestry that again is interesting to me because of what I study are ancestral apparitions. And these are sort of stories of ghosts and apparitions and supernatural visions that have occurred throughout the last, I would say the last maybe 150 years or so. And, you know, I think maybe I've written about all of them, so I'm not going to go through them all, but it just gives you a kind of sense, you know, that some of these did occur, and they did, I don't know, it's kind of scary and spooky, but I love this kind of side of things where you get these kind of really cool stories about, you know, ghosts and the haunted rocking chair, which I love that one, and there's just some really cool stories. So hopefully when you guys, or if you guys embark on your ancestry, you might hear some of these cool, kooky, quirky stories yourself. So I've definitely come across quite a few in my last 3 years. So that was kind of the overview. Hopefully you guys have got a general good idea now of who my ancestors were, where they resided. I'm just going to go now across those different lines of my ancestry, like I mentioned before, and then just to explore a little bit over these families, of just a brief explanation of who these people were, and some of the more interesting, notable people that were part of these families. So we'll begin with my paternal line, which is my father's father, and that is the Taylor and Stringfellow families. So here you've got on the left-hand side, Frederick Taylor, who he looks really cool. He looks like he belongs in the Peaky Blinders kind of film, the TV show. And then you've got Ellen Taylor, or Nee Stringfellow. So she's part of the Stringfellow family, who we're going to speak about first. So we've got the Stringfellow family, very, very interesting. They were situated around the areas of Coppell, Standish, Wigan, and Chorley, Wrightington, places like that in south of Preston, pretty far south of Preston, really. 10 or so miles, I think, south of Preston, maybe even more, probably more actually than that. And these were mainly colliers coming into sort of the 18th century. Sorry, the 19th century. They were mainly colliers. Before that, back into the 18th century, most of them were farmers, you know, husbandmen, yeomen. But when the mining industry started in Coppell, that's when the men started to migrate to a sort of collier, coal miner kind of work, and the women usually either were sort of homemakers, or some of them as well were cotton weavers as well, especially going into the 1900s. And so in a way, this family's been quite easy to sort of document because of the distinctive last name, and we'll come across this again in some later families, this idea that the more distinct the name, the easier it is to document the family, because they're easier to find and there's less of them in a way. So I've been able to trace this family back to Thomas Stringfellow, 1670 to 1717. So there you're going into the 17th century there. So it's a really good family in that sense. We don't have that same kind of distinctiveness, of course, with the Taylor family, because the Taylors there's so many Taylors. It's such a common last name, and it makes it so much harder to kind of decipher really what families they were part of, what they were not part of. Here are just some associated places with Coppell. People who are from Coppell will be very familiar with Birkacre Brow, Chisnell Hall Colliery, The Coppell Parish Church, of course. These are not all the places, but just a few that are particularly associated with my ancestry in this area. And then you've got my grandfather down there on the right-hand side, outside the house that he built called Peacehaven in Coppell. And I've written a lot about my grandfather and his amazing life and who he was, and a lot of his sort of, because I'm proposing him for recognition in the Catholic Church, a lot of his iconography is to do with collieries and coal mining and things like that. So it's just been great to go back in time and explore his upbringing and his life in a lot more depth than what I had ever done before. Here we have sort of the direct line, really, of Stringfellows, going back to that same Thomas Stringfellow, 1670 to 1717. And it's just great. How fantastic is it that I can go from my grandfather, Derek Taylor, who died in 2011, I can go all the way back, direct line, reliable direct line back to Thomas Stringfellow in 1670. Who was born in 1670. It's just brilliant. That's what I love about it. Of course, there's still missing information. You've got James Stringfellow there in the middle. We're not quite sure when he died, but we'll fill it in eventually. It just takes time. That's all it is. And there on the right-hand side, you've got some members of the Stringfellow family. I mentioned before that some of my ancestors became Mormons in the 19th century. And some of those were part of the Stringfellow family, namely Margaret Stringfellow. She married a man named Hugh Robinson, and they went across to the United States in 1891. So quite a lot later on than the Moon family, who I'm going to speak about a little bit later on, who were actually the first English Mormons to go across to the United States. Margaret went across a lot later on, but she still went across and she was still a Mormon pioneer. So that's amazing. Hopefully one day I will get to go to Salt Lake City. I can't wait to do that. It'll be so fun to go there and visit some of those places that I know that my ancestors were part of. Margaret was, I think, something like my grandmother's or great-grandfather's auntie. So she's pretty closely related to me. So it's quite interesting. And then you've got the Taylor family still on my paternal side. We know comparably little about the Taylor family, and I'm going to do more work on this as we go on. But we do know that my great-grandfather, Frederick Taylor, he was a collier, of course, like many of them were back then, around Coppell area. And that he died in 1954 in a car accident. And those are the two main pieces of information that I know about him. He had quite a few children, I think about 9 children, something like that. But again, as I mentioned before, because Taylor is such a common name, it's really a lot harder to decipher which Taylors they are. And obviously, people who are doing their ancestry right now will be able to tell. They can sympathize with me, is what I mean, that it can be very difficult. I would say that the most notable Taylors are my 2 grandparents, Irene Mary and Derek Taylor, because they were Catholic figures. My grandfather was a locutionist, so that means that he experienced interior locution during his lifetime. And then also my grandmother was a catechist and just a devoted Catholic. So I've looked into their stories, their life stories. They're amazing individuals, and I've written a whole separate book on them that is coming out in April. So look out for that if you're interested in learning about why I think that they should be proposed for beatification in the Catholic Church, which is, of course, a huge endeavor to undertake, and one that is going to take a lot longer to see through, but it's exciting. It's all exciting. Here you've got my grandmother's side. So this is my maternal side. paternal, maternal. So that's my father's mother's side. And these families are the Hardacre and McKerney families. So you might be able to tell now who's going to be the Irish, where the Irishness comes from in me. So this is Richard Hardacre there on the right-hand side, who is my great-grandfather. And we can trace the Hardacres back quite far as well, going back to the 1665, again, similar time frame to the Stringfellows. So, you know, again, because it's a distinctive surname and it's very well known in the area and there's a lot of information about them. So it can just depend on that. It really can, as to how far you get back with your ancestry. It can depend on your name and how distinctive the name is. And if it isn't, it's a lot harder. So that's just kind of what it comes down to, really. My grandmother's ancestry is very much centered around Higher Walton, particularly the Hardacre family, Higher Walton. You've got St. Patrick's Church there. You've got All Saints Church as the Anglican church. You've got my grandmother there on a motorcycle at the back of Kitlimbo and Brow in Higher Walton. So this is just a typical Lancashire village. Mill workers, not as many colliers here, of course, because that was more Coppell, but definitely mill workers, weavers. These were the types of people who were there. And then you've got the McKerney side, which is, of course, the Irish part of my ancestry, which we can trace back to 1789. So not as far as the Hardacres, because getting that kind of information from Ireland is very, very difficult. I don't think the Irish, because of the politics and things, they didn't have as many records. And so I am trying. I will continue to try, but they just don't exist. They just don't exist there. Hopefully, one day I'll get to travel across to Ireland. I hope. Because that's where, to Northern Ireland specifically, Enniskillen, that's where the McKerney family that I'm descended from originally came from. And then we've got the Prescott Warbrick side. So we'll move over now to my maternal paternal side. So that's my mother's father's side. And this side, actually, we know the most about because my granddad, Bill, has been doing all of this work with me. He started the work before I started it, and then I got involved, and we've just been bonding over this ever since. And we've been able to get information from his older sister, Auntie Monica, who's still alive, who's 94. So in that sense, it's just been really great. It's been a great bonding experience. It's been something that has brought us both closer together. And of course, one thing that is certainly true is that when you have that missing link, it can be really, really difficult. So I only got involved with Ancestry in 2019. Before that, I wasn't really interested, I'm a teenager and I wasn't really bothered about it because it seems all boring and stuff, but I've changed since then. And of course, my grandmother, Irene, died in 2015. So I never got to ask her directly about this information. And so what you do is you get handed down information from your aunties and uncles, your mum and dad, but it's not the same as that direct experience that your grandparents have. So it's really, really crucial. If you have grandparents and you want to get involved with Ancestry, make sure that you ask them as many questions as you can, because it does take a long time and they don't always remember everything at the same time as well. Sometimes it can take months and maybe years for them to, have revelations over information that they may have forgotten about. So it's really important to do that. It's one of my biggest regrets, is not getting involved in Ancestry sooner, and certainly soon enough to ask my paternal grandparents questions about where they were from. And it would have just made the process a lot easier, is what I'm saying. You make it a lot harder for yourself by not having that link there, it becomes a lot more difficult because you're starting off with so much less information. But you'll get there eventually, but it is easier when you start off with your grandparents. So on this side, sadly with the Prescott side, we've not been able to go too far back. We've got back to Henry Prescott, 1776, 1843, and you can see there that the name spelling changed. So sometimes that can happen and it can confuse, and it's just another obstacle to overcome as part of ancestry researchers, people changing the names, and it's just confusing for us. It's it's great that they did that, but sometimes it can be confusing when you're looking back. And then the moon side, which is, I would say, the side of my ancestry that we know most about. There's been books written about this family, the moon family. There's so many people a part of this moon family that we know a lot of information about. So I would say the moon family is the one that we know the most about, and it's the most interesting for me at the moment. And these were farmers, and I think if you just go back to the previous slide, we got back to the early 1500s there, I think 1528 or something like that. So we're really pushing that boundary. Before that, like I said, very few, very, very, very few recorded things. So we've done well to get that far back, but yeah, they were farmers, around Eccleston area, not Eccleston, Whitley Woods, Exton area, but also going back in history around Eccleston, and most of them were Anglicans going back further. And of course, Ralph and Agnes Moon, the people who were in that photograph I spoke about earlier, they are part of this family. So they're a great family, really interesting. Notable moons. We've got Henry Moon, who was one of the first Mormons who I was speaking about earlier. He traveled with other members of the Moon family on the Britannia from Liverpool to New York City in 1840. So he was one of the first English Mormons to do so. And also you've got some of his family members there, and also you've got William Moon, who was an English Quaker. So going back into sort of the 1600s, you have some of these early Quakers who were imprisoned in Lancaster Castle, which I visited last year, and it's a great place to visit if anyone's nearby. So again, you can see that a lot of the history here is all centered around new religious movements, which is quite interesting. The fact that these people were imprisoned, if they'd not joined these movements, they wouldn't have been imprisoned, and so we wouldn't have known anything about them. So it's it's kind of good that they were in prison, because we wouldn't have known very much about them otherwise. And it's good that they sort of stuck to their faith in that sense. So, and of course, learning about the Mormons was so interesting for me. And I didn't even know there was such a history of Mormonism in Lancashire before I did my ancestry. And now it's kind of just opened up this whole other branch of study for me. Then you've got the Warbrick side, which is, of course, you could say it's still my maternal paternal, but it's just another branch of that side. And again, we've gone quite far back with them to 1570. So again, we're pushing that boundary again, but not quite getting back into the 1400s, sadly. But again, we get that really direct line from me all the way down to Richard Warbrick in 1570. So it's brilliant. It's great stuff. The Warbrick family, before they moved to Clayton Green, Whitley Woods area, they were centered around Garstang, and then before that they were centered around Blackpool, like I mentioned earlier. And they were wheelwrights in Clayton Green. They were probably farmers, really, mainly. And some of them landlords at the Royal Oak Inn, of course, at Whitley Woods. So really interesting people, really, really interesting people, hardworking. A lot of tragedies happened in their lives, lost children, the death of husband or wife early, you know, things like this from illnesses, but they got through it, and it's quite inspiring to read about their stories in that sense. And then finally, we have my maternal side, which again, sadly, we don't know too much about, but we've gone back pretty far, 1532, so we've done pretty well. It's one of the furthest back we've gone, which is the Farnworth family. And then they were more centered around Preston city centre itself for quite a long time, really, rather than the sort of the villages around Preston. They were more sort of in the city centre of Preston. Of course, it wasn't a city then; it was just a town, really, then. But here are just some places that are associated with this family. And then we've got the Cometan family. Again, don't know much about them. Sadly, some trails just go cold after a few generations, which is sad, but time will tell, I suppose. The more work we do, the more we'll figure out. Who these people were and how far back we can go. And so it's just a process. It's just a journey in that sense, a journey in time, a journey in history, I would say. So I think hopefully I've inspired people there to look at their own ancestry. If anyone is based around the Lancashire area and they have similar sounding surnames to some of the people in this video, please do get in contact with me, because you never know, it could be related. So hopefully we might get some new leads there. So anyone who's involved in Ancestry, go to ancestry.co.uk, or one of the other ones. You know, you can go to My Heritage. You know, they're all pretty good, but I like ancestry.co.uk the most. And I hope that you've enjoyed this video. It's a little bit different for a conversation with Cometan this time, but hopefully it's inspired you to look into your own past. So I will see you in the next episode, which will be episode 13 of season 3 of A Conversation with Cometan. See you later, guys.